So the first shot we are going to look at is HDB10. Let's just take a quick look at the shot itself. We go into the HDB10 folder. There should be a Playblast movie file. And if you look at that, it's a character walking towards a window. So we'll have sunlight coming through the window. And if you look at the back, at the end of the shot, there's a light which switches on. So it's a little bit of a dynamic situation. Our first step, we'll want to load in the HDRI we just stitched. Remember that ended up in the onset folder. If we go there and go into 01, load in the HDRI 01. So if you look at this, the one thing you'll notice, it's fairly big. It's 8K resolution. We don't need that much resolution. So I want to actually reformat the image to make it smaller. And so under reformat, in the output format, let's choose a 4K lat long. And you can see the aspect ratio is slightly different, or because the resolution is slightly different. We can fix this by changing the resize type to distort. And it will distort the image a little bit, but that's okay for how we're using it. It doesn't quite matter. Now, for some settings, for some tools, we'll rely on the project settings. So hit S and then go to the project settings and change the full size format to 4K lat long as well. Now, the next step is to change the color space. Remember, Huggins outputs linear sRGB. So add an OCIO color space and go in the color spaces utility and select linear sRGB for the input. And you see the colors changing. It's less warm, less saturated. This should match the look we had of the bracket files. Okay, now let's save the Nuke file. I'm going to save it under onset, the HDRI01, basically in the same folder as the HDRI, so we can find it easily later again if we have to go back in. And as next step, I want to load in the reference footage. So navigate to HDB10, to the actual shot, under LM, and in the ref folder, you'll find the neutralized reference footage. So you can open that up. Just one frame is enough. And just to show you, I'll also load the source, the actual plate. You can switch on sequences, then it'll combine the image to a sequence, and we select the neutralized EXRs again. So load that in as well. And there you go, so that's the plate, and this is the reference. And we need an OCIO color space again, so hit tab, type in OCIO color space, and the input is actually ACES 2065, so switch it to default, yep. And you can see a slight difference in terms of saturation. So since we want everything to work in ACES CG, we basically need to convert the images all into the same color space. And now we're set, we can start grading the images. And if you take a look at the reference, you can kind of see where the reference spheres are set versus the HDRI. I'm just going to show you, just to compare, I will show you the source, the non-neutralized plates. And the difference is relatively big, so it has a lot stronger green cast to it versus the neutralized plates. And neutralized is not necessarily fully neutral. It just means that the all the shots within the sequence will have the same look or will be as close as possible. Now let's take a look at the Macbeth chart, because we're going to use the Macbeth charts to match the HDRI to the reference. And you can see in the HDRI, the Macbeth chart is on that little sofa chair. So we want to actually make that more visible. So create a spherical transform node. The spherical transform node, basically you can convert a projection from a lat long, and we want a cube mat. And in the cube mat, change the format to faces. Faces will let you define which face we want to look at, and that's -y, so to look down. So -y gives us the Macbeth chart almost in the center of the frame. And from here on, we can create a crop node, and using a crop node, kind of crop into the image as close as possible to the Macbeth chart. And once that's done, just switch on the reformat node because we don't want all the black around the image. There you go. That's much better. Okay, and the next step is a transform node, because my goal is to match the reference sphere, the reference footage, the position of the Macbeth chart to the one in HDRI. So that's why I'm rotating it around so the gray bars kind of line up, and then I'll move my transform to the position of the Macbeth chart in the ref footage. Just try to line it up as close as possible. In the merge node, you can pull down the mix so that it's easier to see both images. It doesn't have to be exact, just roughly lined up. Change the mix back to 1 if you select the OCR color space and hit 2, and just with Control Shift left click, you can drag a square box on the third image, which is your 18 or 20% gray, and then hit 1 on the merge node and switch to wipe on the viewer. So what wipe does is basically it'll display both images at the same time, one over the other, whichever way you set it up. What we are mainly interested in is that it displays RGB values for both images at the same time, where we are basically sampling the image. That makes it much easier to match the colors together. And you can see the HDRI is much darker because the Macbeth chart was in a different position. There's a lot less light which came to it. It's also just the way we exported the EXRs. So create a grade node, hit G for that, increase the gain to 4. The gain doesn't quite matter as much. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just so we can see it better. We're gonna adjust the brightness in Katana. And so my first step would be to actually adjust the black point, kind of get the low ends closer to the reference. And so you can click on the second symbol to the right. Black point is quite sensitive too, so it's very small values we have to change. And you can use the sliders, or if you click inside of the numeric box, you can use the up and down keys to kind of adjust the values. Now I'll move on to the white point and adjust that as well. Shifting the white point will shift the black point again. We're going to concentrate later more on the mid-gray values and the black point. What I'm trying to get to is kind of the same colors, or as close as possible, but the brightness is something which is okay if it's slightly different. Okay, now that we have the white point, let's go to our mid-gray, our 18%. And you can see it's not quite 80%, it's actually 20% gray, which is okay. Again, it's more about getting the relative color balance between RGB correct rather than getting the brightness right. So I'll just adjust that and get it kind of close-ish. And now let's take a look at the black point again and the white point. You can see the white point has gone darker again. So, and the black point's a little bit too lifted. So let me just adjust that. Okay, now if we look at our gray point, yeah, that it's a bit darker, but doesn't feel too bad. Okay, so I'll just adjust the mid-gray, I want that to match the closest. The black point and white point is kind of more to get the contrast in the image right. But again, we're comparing a Macbeth chart, which is shot in different locations, so differences are to be expected. You have to kind of play a little bit with the values to find something which works. But taking the midpoint, the gray point, as your baseline is your best bet to get good results. Okay, now that I'm done, I want to actually look at the HDRI. So let's select the crop nodes and the spherical transform and just switch that off. You can select them and hit D. That switches, that deactivates nodes in Nuke. All right, now if you look at our HDRI and compare it with the ref image, you can see the HDRI feels too bright. And again, these were shot within 10 minutes of each other, but the lighting did change a little bit. So that has an effect as well. But I'm just going to drag the gain down a little bit just so that the relative brightness is similar between both images. We can adjust that later in Katana. Just as a starting point, I'll just select something, a value which kind of makes sense. All right, so the next step would be to extract the window light because we want control over the size later and how we position it. So create a spherical transform node again, hit tab, spherical transform, and same deal. Let's switch to a cube map, switch to faces, and -Z already shows us the window, which is great. And the next step is to create a corner pin node because I want to stretch the window all the way to the edge of the images. So create a corner pin, switch to the From tab, and now take each of the corner points and just move them until you get the image or the windows to the edge of your image. Do that for all four. All right, it doesn't have to be exact. This is close enough. And the next thing, in the right node, I'll just first set the output. I will export this into the same folder as the HDRI. So HDRI01, and I'll call it HDRI01 underscore window.txr. I'll add a .cc just so we know it's color corrected already. All right, so now let me just add a shuffle node. In a shuffle node, click on that little D to make the alpha channel solid. And on a shuffle, I'll just create a crop node just to make sure the image is cropped to the correct size, and then render the window HDRI out. Before I move on, I want to export the HDRI we've color corrected. So add a right node, and again, I'm going to add a shuffle node just to make sure the alpha is solid. And in the right node, I will export it into the same folder, call it HDRI01 underscore cc. HDRI1.cc.exr, and save that. The CC stands for color correction. This is just so I know I can identify easily which HDRI I should pick up, because we always want the color corrected one. Right, now we're done with this. So the extracted window, if we set it up as a separate light, we want to remove that from the HDRI itself, otherwise you'll have doubling up. So create an in-paint node, hit tab, in-paint. If you view it, you can see it blurs everything. So we just want to blur the window. Now hit P for rotopaint, and it creates a rotopaint node. And connect the matte input of the input node to the rotopaint. And now we'll create a Bezier shape. So click on the Bezier shape icon and just create a shape around the window. It doesn't have to be too accurate. We actually want it to be a little bit bigger than the window itself, so that when it blurs it, we don't get any bright values. Okay, so now once we're done, let's look at it from the in-paint node. You can see it doesn't do anything because we have to switch the fill region from source alpha to matte alpha. So to tell it to read the alpha of the matte so it knows where to blur. I'll just adjust this a little bit, remove some of those black spots in there. The next thing is the tripod. We could leave it, but I like to remove these things, and often there's actually quite a big black spot at the bottom, so it's more important sometimes. It's less important with this HDRI, but let's just fix it as well. So create a spherical transform node and switch it in the output to cube map again, and format faces and face -y to look down. And we'll do the same thing now as before. So create an in-paint node and create a rotopaint using R, and then use Bezier shapes to kind of create a shape around the tripod. Doesn't have to be too exact. Now connect it to the matte input, and same thing as before, we have to switch the source alpha to the matte alpha. There you go. Now you can notice it's only doing half of the image. And the reason is because the rotopaint node, the format is set to the lat-long format of the source project, of the project settings. So you can see it's kind of being clipped off. You can fix it by changing the clip format to no clip. And there you go. Now it works. And from here, we basically just do another spherical transform back to the lat-long. So projection input is a cube map, and format is faces, and the output is a lat-long. Now, we have to tell it that it's supposed to take the -y axis as the cube map input. So it's a little arrow on the side. If you pull that up, that's your -y, and there you go. Now you should see it transferred into a lat-long. You just see the bottom part. Now select the dot of the original stream and hit M to merge both nodes, and now you can see, if you compare the before and after, the tripod is gone. Okay. Now we can write this out as well as our modified HDRI with the lights removed. So I'll just call it HDRI01 _ no lights.cc. And write this out. So now we have 3 XR files. And let's take a quick look at the spheres, because this shows us all the lighting there. And you can actually notice that the ceiling light is switched on in the ref sphere. If you remember the shot itself, there was a ceiling light which was switching on. If you look at the HDRI, when I captured it, the ceiling light was off. So obviously that's kind of a small problem. But we can fix that by looking at some of the other HDRIs to see if the other ones have the ceiling light on. All right, so let's take a look at the other HDRIs If we go on the HDRI 02, let's open it up, and there you go. So the second HDRI seems to have the ceiling light switched on, which is great, and it's on in all the brackets, which is good. So we can use this to extract the ceiling light. So let's open my plugins again and do the same thing as with the first HDRI. I'm basically not going to go through all the steps again, but just go to HDRI 02, load the TIFFs, and stitch the HDRIs. So we'll fast forward to the end of this when I've finished stitching it. If you need to look up the steps again, you can look at the HDRI stitching section in the earlier session. And just quickly on saving this, I'll save it under HDRI 02 and call it also HDRI 02 .pto for the project file and HDRI 02.exr for the high dynamic range image. Okay, now this is done, and let's jump back into Nuke and load in the XR. By the way, you can also just drag and drop files into Nuke, so you don't always have to use the loader. It'll just create a loader automatically. And there you can see it has a MacBat chart as well. Obviously we have to color correct this as well, but because we want the same colors as the HDRI01, I'm just going to copy those settings over. If we were to do this for the actual shot, I would go in and adjust the colors for that shot because they'll be slightly different. But in this case, this should be close enough. All right, there we go. Now we've got an HDRI with the ceiling light on, and just to compare both to kind of get their brightness relatively the same, because that will definitely help us. In Katana, that doesn't look too bad. Okay, now we want to extract the ceiling light, and I will basically go to the same, like with the window light, I'll create a spherical transform node and switch this to cubicle. Just quickly save this. So my output, I'll switch to cube map, go to faces, and this is going to be -x, I believe. Yes. There you go. And now I'll just create a corner pin node again and kind of try to straighten the image. And same thing, switch to from, and now just move the nodes, the points, until we get a straight image of the ceiling light. It doesn't have to be exact, and I'm not going to stretch the image like we did with the window, but just that it's somewhat straight. Okay, that works. And now I'll add a crop node and kind of crop down to the area of the ceiling light, because that's what I'm actually interested in. I'll keep a little bit of space around it, but I don't want to cut into the ceiling light. Then I just switch on the reformat node, and this should work. Now we just need to write this out. And I'll call this HDRI01 underscore ceiling light. Okay, now render this out and we are set. Now we've extracted all our lights we needed and exported the XRs, and the only step we have to do before we jump into Katana is to convert the images into a format 3D Light understands. 3D Light uses an image format which ends with .tdl. It's basically a MIP-mapped TIFF file. MIP-map means there's multiple resolutions of the same image saved in the file. And this helps with memory optimization during render time. The smaller an object is in the screen space, it can basically load a smaller resolution of the texture and through that saves memory and also some processing time. To convert your image, we use a tool called TDL Make, which is provided by 3D Light. If you type in TDL Make-H, will give you the help with all the settings. Let's navigate to the folder where we have our EXRs we just wrote out in Nuke, because those are the ones we want to convert. 3D Light can also automatically convert your textures. The problem with that is you don't have the control over the settings, so sometimes that is actually detrimental, but you could let 3D Light do this. Here we have your EXRs we just wrote out. So type in TDL Make and add a minus progress. This will give us more information on in the shell when we run it. And minus quality space high to tell TDL Make we want the highest quality or the highest resolution available. And because we're converting environment map, we add a minus n LATL. We don't need this for the normal textures or the other lights, but just for the environment map. So add the file name and the output file with the ending TDL. And now run it, and you'll see different levels. Those are basically different resolutions. And there you go. Now we have a TDL version of our color-corrected environment map. We'll do the same thing for the one where we've painted out the lights. And we're set. Now for the other lights, which are just normal or non-environment map lights, the settings are almost the same. We just don't add the minus n flattel. So again, TDL Make, minus progress, minus quality, space high, and then the input file and the output file. And we do that for both textures. Okay, and now we're done. Let's open up Katana and we can start setting up our first shot.